Why should we care about universal design and accessibility? We're going to talk about this a little bit more, but I wanted to give you kind of the top headlines. There's no such thing as an average learner. And if you've spent some time in classrooms or in tutorials, you know that our learners are very diverse. They have different needs, different accommodations in some cases, and sometimes learners just need variety in the classroom in order to pay attention. Graduate students can play a very important role in removing barriers and promoting access to all learners, and we really can make a difference. And so that's one important thing that we wanted to emphasize today, and also empower graduate students to, take these small changes in their classrooms or tutorials to include more learners. We really want to emphasize that good design helps everyone to learn and access content, and small changes really can make a difference.
Before you go on, let me just add one small point to that. Graduate student TAs are often the very first point of contact for undergrads. So you're the ones who would be maybe seeing written assignments and grading them, and would be in a good position to be able to flag those certain statements that jump out as red flags for mental health issues, for example. I've actually been in an experience as a TA myself where that has happened to me, where I was grading and moving along, and then, whoa, some statement jumped out. It's like, this is a call for help. This is a very concerning statement. And I, as a TA, was in a good position to be able to see that. So you're also often the first point of contact in meetings with students, noticing if somebody isn't submitting. So that's a really pivotal and important point to be at. Go ahead.
Yeah, we play an important role, and I don't think that can be overstated in this session. We really wanted to talk to you today about the fact that there's no such thing as an average learner. And so on the board, we have Nathan, Raj, Addison, and Neela. And really, by looking at these photographs, you cannot tell if any of these learners have disabilities. And so it's important to really design our classes and design our tutorials for everyone, not just an average learner. So Nathan, for example, can't hear well because of small groups chatting all at once and would really benefit from having a quieter place to engage in group work. Raj writes essays and by speaking into a microphone and using a screen reader. And so he would really benefit from, or they would really benefit from having that accessible material and designing those Word documents and PowerPoints to be accessible. For Addison, first language is not English, and therefore they would really benefit from having text available as you're speaking, even if that's in an online environment or in an in-person environment. Neela is a caregiver for a parent with cancer. And so what this results in is that Neela really could benefit from having flexibility of due dates, as well as a no attendance necessary policy. Having tutorials optional really provides that flexibility for learners like Neela. And these diagrams really demonstrate that, we need to remove barriers of access. And so in this diagram on the right, or this picture on the right, you see all of these folks are in a system that's designed for an average learner. There's a fence, and they're all provided the same accommodation or access to this. And what it really demonstrates is that we need to design systems that not only promote accommodation, but design for diverse learners. And so the diagram in the middle shows where everyone is being provided accommodation, or some folks have been provided an accommodation so that everyone can see the soccer field. But what it would really benefit is if we designed it for diverse learners and removed the fence or provided a chain link fence. So in that case, removing all systematic barriers so that accommodation isn't necessary. Or I shouldn't say accommodation isn't necessary, because there will always be some needs for accommodation or in some ways, but we should try to reduce as many systematic barriers as possible. What comes down to it, universal design is simply just good design. And your handout for the information handout has a bunch of definitions on it, including universal design. And so you'll see this definition, and you're welcome to follow along with these definitions as we move through the next little bit of material. The design of products, environments to be usable to all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And the fact of the matter is that universal design benefits most people, not just folks with disabilities. And you can see this in the photograph in the right, where both people, a gentleman or a person with a cart, benefits from having an automatic opening door in the same way that someone with in a wheelchair does. And this just allows for kind of an equitable service of meeting needs of everyone without requiring any sort of accommodation. And it's certainly more accessible or universally designed than having a door that requires pushing a button, in which some folks are able to access the door easily and other people have to push the button. So what is the difference between universal design and accessibility? Well, universal design, as I said, is good design, and accessibility fits within that. But universal design is being very proactive with your design and thinking about your instructional materials, your tutorials, and how you're going to include that. Accessibility can be reactive when someone is identified to you that they require more accommodations, then you provide that. But ultimately, the goal is in universal design to reduce that need for accommodation. As I said, you're never going to eliminate the need for accommodation, but reducing that need for accommodation.
Oh, can I just add to that, that
Absolutely.
accessibility can absolutely also be proactive and thought about at the
Oh,
very beginning of design. I'd add another difference between the two is that with accessibility, you're really talking about people with disabilities, and there's legislation that goes along with that. Whereas with universal design, the scope is broader. We're not just talking about people with disabilities, we're talking about any user. So with any ability or disability, or any need or strength or non-strength. So I think that think of universal design as encompassing people with disabilities and other people as well. So people maybe whose first language is not English and they're in your course, or people who identify as a different gender than the typical male or female, where we might have in the past thought of students as being either male or female, and different cultural backgrounds, different norms, different expectations. So universal design is a much broader scope than accessibility.
thanks, Christine. And you can probably, Christine, just go right
Sure,
ahead
I'll just
and start with the presenting information about accommodation or our duty to accommodate.
Yeah, so as I mentioned just very briefly, when we're talking about accessibility, that is tied to legislation. So you'll see that under the Canadian flag, there are two different pieces of legislation that are listed. So at the national level in our country, we must abide by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and most recently in 2019, the Accessible Canada Act. And this legislation is from the federal government. It covers all of Canada. And this newly introduced Accessible Canada Act in 2019 really does address those jurisdictions that are covered by the federal government around transportation, for example, or other banking, telecommunications. So until 2019, we only had provincial legislation, and now with this act, we have this builds on the Human Rights Act and legislation, and it guarantees disability against discriminating against disability for the entire country. In the middle column, you see that's an Ontario flag, and in Ontario, we have the Ontario Human Rights Code and the AODA, or as to spell that out in full, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So interesting note here is that the AODA is known internationally for being one of the very first and most progressive acts on disability, and it's very well known for being very innovative for its time. And these two pieces of legislation really work hand in hand to protect the rights of people with disability in Ontario. Now, take this down to our own campus community, and at the University of Waterloo level, we have for quite a few years had Policy 33, which talks about ethical behavior. More recently, in the last 5 years, we've developed Policy 58 on accessibility. That's one of the requirements of the AODA. The AODA mandates that all post-secondary institutions and beyond and other organizations must have an accessibility policy in place that will describe how they will uphold the AODA and the Ontario Human Rights Code. So this is our own community's statement that is going to say that, yes, we have our own policy that supports this larger provincial legislation and also this the federal legislation. So that just gives you a bit of context that we do have a legal requirement or obligation to support and accommodate students who have disabilities and staff who have disabilities, TAs who have disabilities, grad students, postdocs, all of our campus community. We have a duty to make sure that we are reducing those barriers and giving equal opportunity for everybody to be able to succeed. And this is one of the ways that we are able to do that. So this is where that's one of the difference between accessibility and universal design. This has a legislation behind it. It's very much working in tandem in collaboration with universal design. And universal design is mentioned quite a bit when you look at the requirements in the AODA. So that gives you a bit of context, and I'll turn it back over. No, it's back over to me. So still with me, not back over. Just want to talk about a couple of scenarios that you may typically come across. At least I think we've encountered scenarios like these from TAs and wonder how you would handle these situations. So as a TA, you can imagine, what would you do if a student discloses a disability to you and asks you for an extension? How would you handle that? What should you do? What would you do? You can type in the chat if you want, or you can just pause and think about that. It's a difficult situation to be in sometimes as a TA because as we already talked about, you are often the first point of contact. Students might feel more comfortable disclosing something to you than they would to their instructor. And as you're giving this some thought, I can't actually see any comments written in the chat, any new comments on this. But I want to point out that under the legislation, students are not required to disclose their disability to their teaching staff. So that means that they do not need to tell their instructor, I have a disability, therefore I need an extension. They have the responsibility of enrolling with accessibility services, and accessibility services then manages the accommodations. They do the assessment about what are appropriate accommodations, and they will communicate the need for accommodation with the instructor. Students may still decide that they are comfortable disclosing and they want to disclose, and many students will never want to disclose to the instructor, and they don't need to. This means that you cannot ask a student if they have a disability or if they're registered, because that's private information. Are you seeing anything in the chat, Allison, for us in terms of any responses to this question about what would you do or what should you do?
I don't see anything, Chris.
Okay.
But I could I mean, just offer. Oh, I just heard someone raise their hand. Let's see. Amanda, would you like to go ahead? If you're comfortable speaking aloud, please go ahead. And if not,
Yeah,
type in
sure.
the
I
chat.
was typing, but it was too long. So I figured I would just say it verbally. I think personally, and I think a lot of TAs will feel the same way, is that I would be deferring to the professor in a scenario like that. And the reason that I wouldn't necessarily make a direct connection to accessibility is I have heard from students before that if it can be handled just by the professor and the professor can say, yeah, absolutely, you can take an extra day or two, that's their preference as compared to going through the process of registering with the accessibility. I've heard that from a few different students before. So
Yep.
as a TA, I wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, this is the resource you have to go through. I think I would be deferring to the professor in that situation,
So
personally.
Amanda, can you see any downside of it being handled that way?
Yeah, I can for sure, especially if the professor isn't willing to kind of make those accommodations, then that can definitely be an issue.
But what if they
Um,
are? Like, let's say that they are, and they're very willing. What's the downside in that situation?
I suppose the downside in that situation is that the student would kind of continuously be having to ask each time they needed, assuming I'm kind of assuming that the professor here kind of knows what they're doing in terms of what you were just talking about, Christine, like they know that they're not allowed to ask, oh, what is your disability? Give me details on it and stuff like that. Um, I would also see it being an issue if the student moves on from that course into another course and they don't have as accommodating of a professor the next time, then that could be problematic as well.
Okay, and any other, and anybody can chime in, any other downsides to this model of handling a request from a student who comes forward and discloses a disability? Because there's another big one here that we really need to cover.
Sina, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, so actually, I just want to make analogy. Might not be exactly correct, but this happened to me, like students miss like final exams because of illness. And the way to confirm that you have some sort of authority that you can confirm is like a doctor. So they should have a doctor note that confirms that they have missed the exam so they can be rescheduled. I think the Accessibility Center is sort of a body here who sort of guarantees that this is a confirmed case. So when you have some sort of authority that confirms, then it makes a sort of a legitimate case, so the instructor can rely on. So it's not also only self-evaluated scenario.
That's a really good point. And there's another point tied kind of to that. Like, so you've mentioned that the accessibility services, one of their main roles is to vet medical documentation. And then the other piece of that isn't just to legitimize it and say, yes, we believe you. It's to say that, okay, given this medical accommodation, medical documentation, we assess these to be the appropriate accommodations. And they have experts whose role it is to say, okay, given this documentation, because the documentation doesn't have to say the diagnosis necessarily. The documentation needs to point out the functional limitations. And then the accessibility, I can't remember their name, but the intake person who reviews that documentation, like the documentation specialist, they will then say, okay, well, given these functional limitations, we deem that X, Y, and Z are the appropriate ways to accommodate the student. An instructor does not have that background. They don't have that expertise in evaluating documentation. They have no right to assess documentation. If the student in question comes forward with documentation, we wouldn't expect an instructor to know what an appropriate accommodation would be for the functional limitations that are presented. So it goes beyond, yeah, I want to help my student, I want to do a good job, and just make it easy for them. I'm just going to, provide unlimited time for extension or unlimited test writing time. And I've seen this, I've heard of this happen where the accommodation that the instructor provides is not actually appropriate and actually could even do more harm than good in certain situations. Because they don't have the full picture, they haven't reviewed the medical documentation, they don't know the extent of the functional limitations, and they don't have the expertise to design the appropriate accommodations. So that's a really important piece that that should be kept in mind in terms of taking it, in their own capacity to make those changes or accommodations. So another piece to this question that I should briefly mention, and I'm mindful of our time, is that if a student discloses a disability to you and you want to then defer to the instructor, I think it's important to know if I were the TA in that situation, I would, you can direct the student to speak to the instructor, but you could also say, are you comfortable doing that? And if that student is not comfortable doing that, then, at that point, I think I would be saying, I'm going to give you some information and point you to accessibility services. I don't know if you're registered, and it's not my place to ask you that, but I want to make sure that you're aware of these, because there's nothing that I can do to grant you an extension as a TA, but there is a system in place that supports your need to have an extension for a disability. So providing them with that information, directing them to speak to the instructor. I don't think I would feel comfortable as a TA saying, yeah, you know what, so-and-so came to me, they have a disability and they're struggling with a learning disability. Like, I don't have permission to share that information until I get permission from the student to share that information. So I would be asking the student, are you comfortable with me sharing this information with the instructor? But knowing that you can't grant the extension anyway, it should be handled by the instructor. If any other comments on this before we move to the second scenario here?
Amanda, I see your hand is still raised. did you have any further comments?
No, sorry, I just didn't realize I had to unraise it.
Oh, no problem. I can unraise it for you.
So let's move on to the second scenario. In your in-person, like face-to-face tutorial, you noticed some students are not paying attention, but instead spending time playing online games. You want to ask everyone to put their laptops and devices away, but you know that 2 of your students require technology to fully participate in your lesson. So in other words, use of laptop would be an accommodation. What do you do? How do you handle the situation? And you can raise your hand or type in the chat, whatever you're more comfortable with.
Elizabeth, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me properly?
I can hear you, yes.
Perfect. One of the things that when I was reading this before we got to it, is the assumption that if someone's playing an online game on their computer, phone, whatever, means that they're not paying attention. It's a slippery slope. Like, I can knit and still pay attention to the conversation around me. My husband plays games and still can have a full conversation with me. Like, it's, yeah, I would be very cautious of making the assumption that even if this is not how I would pay attention, that's not how someone else might not pay attention. That was a weird sentence, but
Yeah, that's spot on. We have to check our assumptions, and we don't know. Like maybe some are playing games and distracting themselves. Maybe some need that to be able to pay attention because that helps them to pay attention. So we, be careful of our assumptions. And I think that the temptation to say everybody must put away their laptops must be avoided because you don't know. And I think there was another hand, maybe. I don't want to cut somebody else off. Was there
There
another hand up?
is.
Yeah,
Amanda, do you want to go ahead?
yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, just to add on to what Elizabeth was saying, an approach I take in all my in-person tutorials when they were happening was I would set ground rules at on the very first day, and usually I would kind of remind them on the second tutorial too, because some people miss the first day, and I make it clear that if one of my rules, ground rules, let's say, is if you're on a device, I ask that you're not kind of working on other coursework or doing other things. I don't say that's because you're distracted. I ask that because I find it distracting as a presenter. So I kind of put the onus back on me and I just ask, like, for me to like best deliver content to you. I just ask that you're not kind of multitasking because I find it distracting as a presenter. And then at the end, I kind of invite people, like, if they want to talk about any of the ground rules, we can have an open conversation or they can like contact me afterwards. And that's honest. I do find it distracting as a presenter when people are doing other things. Obviously, in a 300-person lecture, you can't really say that because that's going to happen. But in a small tutorial, that's something I kind of proactively do. And then if a situation arises, I can kind of refer back to those ground rules that I asked about in the beginning.
So Amanda, how would you handle it if in this situation you had a couple of students who are who need the technology and who are on their laptops in the middle of a tutorial with those ground rules?
If I think it really is situationally dependent. It says in this example, it doesn't give a number of people. If it's a lot of the tutorial that I'm finding distracted, I think I would first reflect on like why that is. I think before kind of blaming the students, I would kind of be like, oh, am I just repeating myself a lot and like they're not finding the information valuable? I would maybe midway through the semester, like do a reminder kind of the ground rules, not kind of pointing anyone out, but just like bringing them back, like we talked about in the beginning, the ground rules that I outlined. And then if it was less, like if it was 1 or 2 people, maybe I would consider talking to them privately, but I don't think that would be my first step.
Yeah, I think I would again, let's go back to one of the first comments, like check your assumptions. And I know that in some situations, attendance to tutorials is mandatory, and if you don't attend, you will lose potentially a lot of marks. I know in some courses you can lose your entire participation grade of 10% or more. So students may be required to be there. They may be dealing with a personal family emergency, and they don't feel that they can miss that tutorial to adequately deal with the emergency, so they're going to try to deal with the emergency. I've heard this happening in one class where I spoke with the instructor afterward, and the student was in a very difficult position, had to deal with a very stressful and emotionally charged family emergency, but was required to be in class in attendance. So they were just doing the best they could to manage life and not lose marks because of having to deal with a situation. So again, we always want to remember, check the assumptions. I wouldn't put the student on the spot of having to disclose I had an emergency, or say what the emergency was, or it may be distracting to us, and I get that, Amanda. I've taught many classes where it is distracting to see the faces looking down, maybe smiling at something when I'm not saying anything funny. It's very hard, but we actually don't know, and this goes beyond an accessibility accommodation to that universal design piece. What else might be going on for that student that they are struggling to manage at that time. So the checking the assumptions is a really big piece. What I will say is what you don't want to do is single out the two students and say, you know what, you two, it's okay, you can keep using your laptop because I know you've got an accommodation. Like, no, we would never want to out somebody. And that's where the next slide would come into place. Above all else, respect students' privacy. I think, Allison, there might have been another hand.
Yeah, there is. Sina, would you like to go ahead again? Do you have something to add? And it looks like, Sina, you brought your hand down. So I'm going to trust that we can move on, but feel free to put it up again. If
Sorry, I was muted. I was talking. That's why I brought
Oh,
it.
okay. Sorry about that. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, 2 points. Oh, the first one regarding your laptops and devices. I mean, I understand the concern. The other thing actually, which is actually happening, like before this pandemic, we had exams, final exams, and one of the rules was no electronic devices, no smartwatches, etc., and even not any calculators. For example, when the final exam happens and you have like a theory course, this happens, and then we also had this scenario that some people actually needed more time or devices, and then every exam we had maybe around 5 to 10 people who take the exam in a different place that even I don't know who they are, and then we receive the notes at the end. So they even had extra time, meaning that if the exam was 90 minutes, they might even go up to 4 hours, which basically they are accommodated for that. The
Yeah,
other thing is actually in the second scenario in a tutorial session, I would say I would ask them question about the content, the way that you want to make sure they are paying attention. If you ask a question about the subject that you're discussing, if they can answer it, it means that they are paying attention. That's maybe a way to understand if they are distracted or paying attention to the material.
So would you ask questions just of anybody, like point people out and ask a question? Like you there, Allison, what do you think the answer is to this question in the tutorial as like a spot check?
It's just like an engagement check of the technical subject, not talking about, I mean, if I'm explaining a problem and then I say, what's your opinion? Like if it's a habit that instructor tries to engage students, they ask randomly questions from random people. This is how you overall try to check how, I mean, it's not that they think they have been spotted on or like singled out from other people. You can ask questions from anyone.
Yeah, so that one is that can be a really problematic one, and that we would call that cold calling. Just if you put the question out and just ask in a general way, not single out a person, no problem doing that, and then people can volunteer to answer. But just putting somebody on the spot and asking, Amanda, can you explain this theory or this concept that we just talked about? That, for example, we would advise against doing for a variety of reasons. And again, checking assumptions. And I've even had the experience as an instructor, and I didn't do that, but I would maybe break students into small groups to discuss things. And I mean, sometimes students will have come to me and said, My anxiety is so high that I can't manage that. I will miss class before I will be able to come and participate in that. And it's the same thing with being pointed to and asked a question. There are many students who will forfeit 10% of their grade, miss all of the tutorial marks because they are so anxious about being called upon. They may know the answer. It's not that. It's not that they're distracted. It's not that they're not engaged, but the performance anxiety around being called upon to speak in front of others, and their brain may not work very well in the moment if they're singled out. So that's one of the things that in universal design we would recommend to not do. And yes, that might be a check, but it might not be a reliable check to see if students are paying attention because of those reasons. They may not be able to accurately demonstrate their knowledge.
I think it's for me, I have to remind myself continually because cold calling made up a huge part of my undergraduate degree. And so I myself am comfortable being cold called upon, but that is not, that is not all of our learners. In fact, that's probably a very small percentage of our learners that are actually comfortable with that. And so I think it's important to remind myself included that I succeeded in an academic environment that was not for all learners. That was for a very small percentage of learners.
Yeah, and here you are in graduate school. How many didn't make it that far because they couldn't handle that way of learning? There's actually other strategies for that would not make people demonstrate publicly in front of others. There's lots of other ways you can get students to demonstrate and self-assess their understanding. It may not happen in the tutorial. It may happen later, and that may be what the student needs to be able to do in order to process adequately. I don't want to take too much time on this because we're already at 2:15, and we still have our main activity to get to. So
Yes.
yeah,
So
I'll just want to reiterate the main comment of, above all else, respect students' privacy by not forcing anybody to disclose in front of others.
Perfect. And that was really what we were trying to get at those examples, but a lot of other principles of universal design came up with that. And so I really appreciate your enthusiasm and hope that we can take that into when we move into the breakout rooms. So one thing, or the main thing that we're talking about today is universal design and accessibility. And so we wanted to talk through what are these kind of principles of universal design. And so we did send you a handout ahead of time. You would have received an email from me last night, again this morning with the slides, and I attached the handout with there as well too. And on this handout, there's kind of these four areas of universal design that we want to focus on. Now, if you've done any learning or any reading or informing yourself about universal design ahead of time, you would know that there's lots of principles out there. And the CTE has a lot of teaching tips on this topic. And we've provided some links in the resource slide on that handout as well too. But today we're focusing on four areas: accessibility, variety, flexibility, and supportive class climate. So accessibility is really referring to, are you reducing the unnecessary barriers for a student related to a student's ability to perceive information and understand information? Variety is really about including variety of those instructional formats and methods. And this increases the opportunity for different learners to succeed in your classroom. Flexibility is recognizing the need for flexible, say, deadlines, offering choice in course and assignments to allow for all learners to participate and really feel good and engaged in your class. And creating that supportive class climate really means that we're valuing that diversity and promoting and creating a supportive learning environment that eliminates unnecessary hurdles and demonstrates understanding that mistakes are part of the process. We really want to highlight that mistakes they occur all the time. And so we want to make kind of that low stakes or ability to participate without having to jump over hurdles.